News when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Doug Krisner. On Monday, President Trump is planning to announce tariffs of 25% on all imports of steel and aluminum. Now, this move will apply to metal imports from all countries. Joe Doe covers metals and mining for Bloomberg News.
A lot of difficulty for traders, for buyers in the U.S., and more broadly across the markets across the globe, right? Because the U.S. market kind of sets the tone. And I think there's a concern, right? We had Trump say he was going to put tariffs on, imports from Canada and Mexico last week, and then he pulled back from that. Now he's coming out and saying aluminum and steel tariffs on all incoming imports across the globe.
That is Bloomberg's Joe Doe. Meantime, President Trump suggested that Elon Musk's government efficiency team has found irregularities while examining data from the U.S. Treasury. Trump had this to say to reporters aboard Air Force One.
There could be a problem. You've been reading about that with treasuries. And that could be an interesting problem because it could be that a lot of those things don't count. In other words, that some of that stuff that we're finding is very fraudulent. Therefore, maybe we have less debt than we thought of. Think of that.
That is President Trump speaking there. His remarks, by the way, come as Democrats are sounding the alarm on what they say is overreach by the Trump administration. Senator Andy Kim of New Jersey spoke earlier to NBC's Meet the Press.
They are simply trying to dismantle.
Everyone, good morning to all of you. आज है 10th of February 2025. वेलकम वंस अगेन टू दिस लाइव एनालिसिस। फटाफट से एक बार लेवल देख लेते हैं। क्रूड ऑयल को देखोगे तो अपने रेजिस्टेंस पे ओपन हुआ है, एक दो बार रेजिस्टेंस ले चुका है, थर्ड टाइम आया है। नेचुरल गैस भी रेजिस्टेंस के अराउंड है। दो पॉसिबिलिटी है नेचुरल गैस में, थोड़ा ऊपर जाए तो यहाँ से सेलिंग डायरेक्टली कर लेना, नीचे आता है तो फिर थोड़ा सा ये एफईजी पर रुक सकता है, फिर नीचे सपोर्ट आपका 291 पे रहेगा। बाकी जैसा मैंने बताया क्रूड ऑयल ऑलरेडी रेजिस्टेंस पे ओपन हुआ है, दो तीन बार रेजिस्टेंस ले चुका है, अभी भी है रेजिस्टेंस। नेक्स्ट रेजिस्टेंस फिर आपको 6373 के अराउंड मिलेगा। नीचे एक एफईजी है 6243, फिर नीचे एक सपोर्ट 6188 और 6159। कोई आज डेटा शेड्यूल नहीं है, देयर इज नो डेटा शेड्यूल फॉर टुडे, सो रिमेंबर दिस। बाकी हो सकता है मैं लाइव कंटिन्यू ना रख पाऊँ तो लेवल मार्क करके रख दे रहा हूँ। न्यूज आती है तो वी विल सी दैट।
Dismantle the government. So yes, look, if we have to take steps to be able to hold them accountable, use the leverage that we have to force it, I cannot support efforts that will continue this lawlessness that we're seeing when it comes to this administration's actions.
That is New Jersey Senator Andy Kim. His remarks, by the way, were echoed by Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy. Murphy called on Republicans to join with Democrats in making sure Trump's power does not proceed unchecked. Chinese officials are reportedly building a list of U.S. tech companies that can be targeted with antitrust probes. The Wall Street Journal reports the aim is to collect as many cards as possible to play in expected negotiations with the Trump administration over U.S.-China issues. That would include tariffs that Trump has imposed on Chinese goods. Beijing has already said it is investigating NVIDIA and Google over alleged antitrust issues. Other American firms that could be in the sights include Apple, chipmaker Broadcom, and semiconductor design software vendor Synopsys. On Friday, we got the first U.S. employment report of 2025, and it was a downside surprise. Here's Bloomberg's Michael McKee.
We come in a little bit light this month, 143,000, and last month revised up to 307 from 256, which we all thought was really big at that time. The unemployment rate, it goes down by 1/10 of a percentage point.
That is Bloomberg's Michael McKee. It will be a busy week for earnings, and the outlooks companies offer will be clouded by policies from the new administration. We have a preview from Bloomberg's Nathan Hager in Washington.
This week, we'll hear from Deere, Molson Coors, and Applied Materials. All three report on Thursday. All three could face questions about President Trump's aggressive approach to international trade. We'll also hear from McDonald's, Wendy's, Coca-Cola, Kraft Heinz, and CVS, among others. Meanwhile, Coinbase and Robinhood are expected to post solid growth, with President Trump taking a friendly crypto stance. Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
Elon Musk is not interested in buying the U.S. operations of TikTok. More from Bloomberg's Denise Pellegrini.
Musk says he has not put in a bid for TikTok and doesn't have any plans for what he would do if he had it. Amid security concerns, U.S. lawmakers have been trying to ban the popular social media app in the U.S. or get owner ByteDance to sell it. At a conference hosted by the billionaire chief exec of German media conglomerate Axel Springer, Musk also said buying Twitter, now X, was an exception, and he says he usually prefers building his own companies from scratch. President Trump, on his first day in office, signed an executive order that temporarily halted a forced sale or shutdown of TikTok. Denise Pellegrini, Bloomberg Radio.
Super Bowl 59 is underway in New Orleans, and with a couple of moments left, Super Bowl 59 is underway in New Orleans, and with a couple of minutes left in the fourth quarter, the Philadelphia Eagles are leading the Kansas City Chiefs 40-6. That is news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Doug Krisner, and this is Bloomberg.
Donald Trump has already changed the way we think about the U.S. economy.
This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston, bringing you stories of capitalism. This week, as President Trump takes drastic action to curtail federal spending, Ray Dalio of Bridgewater lays out his plan for what needs to be done. Plus, Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla announces earnings that include his huge investment in tackling cancer. And we tell you the story of scientific sleuths uncovering bad research, setting back the quest for an effective treatment for the millions of people affected by Alzheimer's. But we start with a story about what we do for a living. In a week when monthly jobs numbers came out, they raised the larger question whether President Trump's policies, from stimulating parts of the economy to contracting others, will keep the American jobs engine humming. Something our special contributor Larry Summers of Harvard knows something about.
The proximate effect, of course, is that you protect some jobs in the industry that's tariffed. But there are effects that go in the other direction. When you put a tariff on steel, it gets more expensive for auto producers, and that makes them less competitive. When you put tariffs on, the dollar goes up, and that makes it more expensive for anybody who's trying to export products from the United States. When people pay higher prices because of tariffs, they have less money to spend on goods other than the tariff jobs, and that hurts jobs. So it's very hard to know which way the effect will go or whether there'll be any positive effect. It depends in part on what the Fed does, but the idea that protection is some kind of solvent that creates large numbers of jobs, I don't think would be supported by most economists. After all, if that were right, Argentina would have had a great record through the years at having low unemployment.
What's the best case for Donald Trump's argument for tariffs? You sometimes agreed with him, sometimes actually disagreed with him. But what's the best case you could make for President Trump's case on tariffs?
Look, I think the argument is that it's a negotiating tool and that there are important things that we want to achieve in negotiation. Whether we will achieve those things, I think very much remains to be seen. Whether the aggressiveness with which we've pursued this strategy will ultimately make cooperation with other countries more difficult, that remains to be seen. But I think the best argument for this approach is a set of considerations based on leverage. And of course, there are also arguments for specific tariffs in specific sectors that are directed at ensuring that our economy is adequately resilient. I certainly feel much better about the situation with the tariffs suspended and negotiations underway than with the tariffs actually imposed. And we're just going to have to watch and see how all this plays out. I do think the United States has gained an enormous amount from an international approach based on international rules. And when we flaunt those rules, we may make it more difficult for such a system to exist. And that may ultimately undermine
what our interests are. So we're going to have to watch very carefully.
Larry, with respect to jobs specifically, the job market is fairly robust. It has been a fairly strong job market, low unemployment. If, in fact, there are other reasons for imposing tariffs, as you suggest, some geopolitical reasons, some political reasons, is this a good time, actually? Can President Trump, in a sense, afford to risk a little bit on the jobs front?
Well, it's a good time on jobs. It's a nervous-making time on inflation. And we're all hoping that inflation's durably going to get back to the 2% target, but it's not quite there. And that's why interest rates are being kept at a level where mortgage rates for families are very high. And so I think we have to be very careful with respect to what we do that is going to influence the price level. So I think economists are going to be watching very carefully what all of this means.
Shannon O'Neill is an economist at the Council on Foreign Relations specializing in trade. She sees a direct connection between President Trump's new trade policies and jobs, and it's not necessarily good.
So tariffs actually could have the wrong effect on jobs. We've seen strong job growth in the United States. The United States is really a robust, booming economy, one of the strongest right now in the whole world. But tariffs may take some of that away. And the reason they will do that is because so much of U.S. production, particularly in manufacturing and factories and the like, depends on selling to our neighbors, to Canada, to Mexico, because of integrated North American supply chains. So if you put on tariffs and you break down the supply chains, then you're not selling engines from New York down to Mexico to put into cars. You're not selling produce or cattle or other things that go to Canada, go to Mexico. You break down the supply chains and jobs get lost.
As of right now, they've suspended the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. If they went into effect as previously announced by the president, which sectors would be hit the first?
So one of the sectors that would be hit the hardest is the automotive sector. This we see in automotives very integrated supply chains across North America. So first you would see losses because of higher costs. If it's 25% more expensive to import things from Mexico and Canada, then the parts and the components that are made in the United States don't get shipped down there to be assembled into cars into Mexico or into Canada. So that's one way you lose jobs. The other way you lose jobs is that those cars that are sold in the United States just cost more.
As President Trump goes into this negotiation with Canada and Mexico, does he have by far the upper hand given the degree to which those economies depend on the United States as opposed to the United States depending on them?
So they look out at the many countries that Trump has threatened tariffs or in some cases putting tariffs on, and Mexico and Canada are distinctively vulnerable. Trade for these economies is so important overall. 70% of their GDP comes from trade, and trade with the United States is paramount. It's almost 75, 80% of trade for Canada, for Mexico, comes to the United States. So they are uniquely vulnerable to these kinds of tariffs. China, Europe, yes, trade with the United States is important, but it's much smaller as part of their overall economy and as part of their overall export market.
We're talking right now about President Trump potentially changing the terms of trade with Canada and Mexico. He's also talked obviously about China. He's imposed 10% on China. What about actually tightening up the existing terms of trade? We also saw the United States Postal Service saying they're going to suspend the so-called de minimis rule. Give us a sense of what the government could do with China or with others, actually to tighten down on what things are going on right now.
So there are many tools you have to manage trade. Tariffs are one, and that seems to be one that we're starting with in the Trump administration. But there are many other ways. There are import controls, there are licenses, and there are things like the de minimis rule, which says that anything that's imported that costs less than $800, you don't have to go through the paperwork. You don't have to pay tariffs and the like. That, at least temporarily, has changed for Hong Kong and China. They're looking at all those packages that are coming in, which are the tune of 300 million packages a year that are coming in under this de minimis rule, so lower than $800. Some of that is, fast fashion. It's companies like Shein and Temu, which sell you $5 t-shirts and other trinkets and the like. So some of it is that. But there is a worry, and perhaps a justifiable worry, that in those packages are also coming things like fentanyl pills, which are very small, can come in a small package, precursors, or things that are more expensive that are evading the tariffs because they come in a small space.
We're talking about a lot of hypotheticals because we're not sure what actually will happen or when. But talk to us about the time between we find out what happens. What about that period of uncertainty for U.S. businesses in making decisions about employing people, investing? What does that do to the economies?
Well, the time in between and even what it will look like and how long it will last, this all creates incredible uncertainties. So if you're a CEO or the board of directors of a company, you're trying to think about what suppliers you'll use or what your final markets will be and what the costs and the profit margins will be. You really have much less visibility into that. It could be 25% more expensive, or you could earn 25% less if you're selling into particular markets, or it could all go away. So what I think we will be seeing is freezing of much foreign direct investment, freezing even of investment here in the United States, and freezing of growing jobs, of growing footprints. It will be very difficult for businesses to operate.
Coming up, millions of Americans are afflicted by the dreaded disease of Alzheimer's. Billions of dollars are spent each year to find a cure. But have we been on the wrong track? And did some scientists lead us there? That's next on Wall Street Week. This is a story about lost opportunity, the opportunity to make real progress fighting one of the most devastating diseases we know, Alzheimer's, with questions now being raised about much of the work that's gone into finding a cure.
Alzheimer's disease affects millions and millions of Americans, but not just millions and millions of individual patients, but also orders of magnitude larger than that because of the effects on their families and their effects on larger society. This is a massive problem.
Nearly 7 million Americans over 65, about 1 in 9, suffer from Alzheimer's. Costs of care are soaring, $360 billion in 2024, projected to hit $1 trillion by 2050, $400,000 per person, with 70% borne by the family. The race for a cure is on, but not without its setbacks, as Vanderbilt neurologist Matthew Schrag explains. So in recent years, we've had some candidates for treatment come up, even been approved by the FDA and been sold, ultimately, although with some controversy.
This family of drugs that we're talking about are a group of antibodies, and antibodies are a molecule that your body produces naturally. These ones are synthetic ones that have been engineered, and they're designed to bind up a little tiny protein called beta amyloid, and we think that it's poisonous to the brain, and that's thought to be the fundamental driver of Alzheimer's disease. The antibodies administered to patients bind up to that beta amyloid and help to remove it from the brain. And the idea is hopefully that will interfere with the progression of Alzheimer's disease.
Hopefully it will. But in fact, there have been some treatments that appear to make some progress on the science, but don't have clinical results.
Well, so fundamentally, what patients care about is the beta amyloid removed from the brain, right? Patients are concerned about, can they think clearly? Can they remember things? And these drugs didn't robustly show an effect. You had a reasonably good biochemical outcome, but that really didn't help people.
The problem, I think, that we've seen over 30 years of study of the amyloid hypothesis and the development of dozens of anti-amyloid drugs and vaccines is that it hasn't panned out.
Charles Pillar is an investigative reporter for Science magazine.
Many neurologists and other doctors whose patients have asked about these drugs have the opinion that this statistical effect is not really a clinical effect. In other words, the impact is so subtle as to be imperceptible to patients or their families. However, these drugs also come with great risks, including the risk of death or brain damage associated with brain swelling or bleeding that they can cause.
Biogen received FDA approval for the first anti-amyloid drug in 2021, leading to hope for Alzheimer's patients. This and other similar approvals, Pillar says, ignited a market frenzy, but Schrag calls it a dead end, a view echoed in Pillar's new book, Doctored, fraud, arrogance, and tragedy in the quest to cure Alzheimer's. There's been a fair amount of research, work, money being put into it. Why is it that we haven't made more progress?
The simplest answer is that it's a complicated disease. I've become more concerned as time has gone on that research integrity may be part of that equation.
After Schrag criticized the FDA's approval of the Biogen drug, two physicians skeptical of another Alzheimer's treatment, this one from Cassava, hired him to do an independent investigation. Cassava's stock had soared 900%, leading to a $5.4 billion valuation, and the physicians ended up shorting the stock and filing a whistleblower complaint with the SEC.
A number of individuals were concerned that something fishy might be going on and started to examine the basic science and some of the other supporting information around this drug and started to develop concerns. And their attorney reached out to me to be part of the process to evaluate the science behind this drug, Simufilm and Cassava Sciences.
What did you find when you started looking into it?
So, a lot of the basic science that supported the use of this drug came from a single laboratory, a laboratory run by a gentleman named Haoyang Wang at City University of New York. And when we looked at his work, we found an extended pattern of alterations in the data coming out of this laboratory. A lot of the data, a lot of these sorts of experiments, often the output is an image. And sometimes you can see when you look at an image things that make you think it's been altered. It's just in the same way you could walk through a magazine aisle and look at a photo and say maybe that's been touched up. Something strikes you as something unnatural about that image. And so when we went through his work, we found lots of that sort of problems.
But just getting it wrong is something different. That can happen to any scientist.
We all get it wrong. Yeah, absolutely. This is not about making mistakes. We're looking at a very coherent pattern of altering data to fit certain hypotheses. When you collect your data, right, there should be very little reason to make cut and paste type changes within an image. You know, I think there are things that you can see that are universally inappropriate.
Schrag's findings supported a citizens' petition urging the FDA to halt clinical trials.
I was tagged on Twitter in a post where somebody said, "Hey, Elizabeth, you need to look at this." And it was a link to a citizen petition.
Dutch microbiologist Elizabeth Bick is a forensic image expert and pioneer of crowdsourcing to uncover flawed studies. Using such platforms as PubPeer, she and other sleuths publicly share evidence of apparent data manipulation.
These were photos of these scientific papers that looked at Western blots, which are protein blots, and it showed all kinds of problems in these scientific papers. And it looked like a lot of that body of work contained potential fraudulent results. And so I completely agree that it would make sense to ask the FDA to halt the trials on humans. Because if the work done on animals already looks fraudulent, it's very unlikely that it would work.
Do you know what ultimately happened to Cassava and its medication?
There have been a number of investigations. The Department of Justice appears to have pursued a case against Haoyang Wang. He was actually arrested for this type of data manipulation, accusations of data manipulation and fraud. And so I know that case is proceeding.
The stock plummeted 85% in a matter of basically minutes when it was announced that the drug had failed. And so what happened is a lot of people in the market lost money on this drug, enormous amounts of money. The question I have is why the FDA, which is the agency that had the power to intervene, didn't do anything for literally years, knowing what they knew.
Cassava says it is cooperating with the DOJ and has made changes to the leadership team. Wang pleaded not guilty, but what Pillar and Schrag had found led them to look beyond Cassava, enlisting a team of private citizens, including Bick, to investigate whether there might be other problems with Alzheimer's research. They say they uncovered numerous instances of data manipulation going all the way back to one particularly influential paper published nearly 20 years ago.
We were both kind of stunned when we together discussed this experiment by Karen Ash and Sylvain Lesnay that was so instrumental to the field and yet seemed to be very suspect.
Ash and Lesney's 2006 Nature publication shaped the field's understanding of Alzheimer's.
The amyloid cascade hypothesis took a bit of a stumble in the early 2000s, and this group of investigators, Karen Ash and Sylvain Lesney, were one of those who came in and said, aha, we think we've identified the silver bullet.
And so what you had is, for the first time, ostensibly, an experiment that showed a kind of cause and effect, direct cause and effect of a substance that seemed to be causing Alzheimer's disease, and lo and behold, it was a amyloid beta protein.
And it sort of rescued the amyloid hypothesis. It was cited thousands and thousands of times, and variations of this theme were developed. But what we found in the course of doing this research integrity work, I bumped into a number of papers from Sylvain Lesney, the first author, and we found that there seemed to be artifactual changes in his work as well, including in this famous Nature paper. And as we analyzed that paper, we found that the majority of the figures seemed to have evidence of tampering in them.
And I understand Dr. Ash actually has withdrawn the paper now.
She has. It was retracted in the last 6 months or so.
The University of Minnesota conducted an investigation and found no research misconduct, but the authors, with the exception of Lesney, agreed to retract the paper, and Ash took responsibility, though she said she had no knowledge of any image manipulations until it was brought to my attention. She continues to back the amyloid hypothesis and her conclusions. Lesney has not commented and remains in good standing with the NIH. According to Ash, Lesney denies fabricating the data. How did NIH react?
What I can tell you is that we saw very slow progress in dealing with these things. We saw Sylvain Lesney continue to get funding, even new funding, after these reports came out and were widely accepted that these were serious problems. And initially you wonder, how could that be? Until you take a larger look at the field and you realize that the leadership of the NIH has not been completely immune to these types of problems.
The administrator overseeing Lesney's NIH grant co-authored the now retracted Nature paper. The team also found issues with the work of the man who led the division at the NIH National Institute on Aging.
A gentleman named Eliezer Maslia, who was the neuroscience director at the NIA. And this was probably one of the most prolific cases of apparently doctored data that I'd ever seen. We stopped analyzing when we got to something like 130 papers and just said that's enough. We can't spend the rest of our lives looking at this. But this is somebody who has been able to ascend to the very highest echelons at the NIH.
The day Pillar's report in Science was published, Maslia was removed from his post. So it appears that there is a broader problem than you first understood. I wonder what thoughts you have about where it comes from.
Science is a human endeavor, right? Scientists are people. The Garden of Eden happened to all of us, right? We are all flawed people, and scientists are going to be subject to the same temptations as everybody else. And so I think part of what needs to happen as a discipline is that we need to be a little bit less naive.
What advice do you have for an investor, given what you've said about some of the problems with science? It really is quite unsettling if we think the science we think we know, we don't know.
If you're going to make an investment of not only millions or tens of millions or sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars in clinical trials, but also ask hundreds or thousands of patients to accept the risk of exposing themselves to experimental drugs, we should start with, do we think we're starting from a trustworthy foundation? That's a fair question, and it should be asked consistently. And I think that sometimes it's time to ask the field to move on, right? I think that even a non-scientist can listen to Alzheimer's research over the last 30 years and say, I've been hearing amyloid and amyloid and amyloid, but what's not changing is what's happening for our family members, right? And that it's time for something else. Before we do this again, tell me why it's going to be different this time. And I think that the investors can motivate change.
Coming up, when Pfizer announced its earnings this week, many were focused on its huge commitments to finding a cure for another dreaded disease, the disease of cancer. We hear from Pfizer's CEO Albert Bourla about his plans to do for cancer what Pfizer did for COVID. That's next on Wall Street Week. This is
Over the past decade, we've seen a more fragmented world. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean globalization will change. Globalization will stay. There are multiple ways to make sure that the world remains globalized.
a story about hope. Hope for those who need it desperately when they learn they have that disease all of us dread, the diagnosis of cancer.
The surgery was successful. However, tests after the operation found cancer had been present.
I know a little bit more. People who've been told they have cancer know a little bit more than other people. That's staring you right in the face, and it may actually happen.
In 2024, the United States hit a new milestone, estimated to pass 2 million newly diagnosed cases of cancer.
One, it is that the cancer incidence is increasing. Right now we have 15 million approximately in the world, people that are suffering from cancer every year. Probably the number will go to 30 plus in 2050. And that is happening because, first of all, people live longer lives, and that the age favors, unfortunately, cancer. But also there are risk factors, and we have better ways of detecting now cancer. So that's one.
They're living longer, but actually we're seeing more incidents, are we not, in younger people, which is surprising.
We are, and this is kind of emerging right now. And there are risk factors, starting from environment, starting from multiple alcohol, smoking, but also it is the fact that we can detect cancers way more efficiently today than we could do it years back.
Dr. Albert Bourla is the chairman and CEO of Pfizer. Under his leadership, the pharmaceutical company partnered with BioNTech during the COVID-19 pandemic to roll out life-saving mRNA vaccines.
How to operate with speed. The vaccine, or the operational warp speed that President Trump actually had initiated, was an operation that removed obstacles, but also within the companies was an operation that we were shooting for the impossible. And we came with the mindset, nothing is impossible. We can make it possible. That's a mindset that we can use again, not to find a solution for COVID, but to find a solution for cancer or for Alzheimer.
Cancer is Dr. Bourla's next big challenge at Pfizer. In 2023, Pfizer completed its $43 billion acquisition of Seagen, a company basing a particular cancer treatment on monoclonal antibodies. Just this week, Pfizer reported earnings that included an increase in spending on oncology to about 25% of its revenue. You have made cancer a real priority for Pfizer in your investments, in your R&D, in your development, even your acquisitions. Why?
Because we think that we are ready to provide a solution. We want to save the world again. And I think our best chance this time, it is with cancer. The science is there. We invest probably double than all the profits that we made with COVID to acquire a new technology, which is promising a lot. The number of U.S. cancer cases may be going up, but the mortality rate is actually going down. It's fallen 34% in the last 30 years. And the National Institutes of Health project that if this trend continues, the United States will have 26 million cancer survivors by 2040, a 44% increase over 2022. Pfizer hopes to keep this trend going through one particular oncology treatment turbocharged by its acquisition of Seagen. It's called antibody-drug conjugate, or ADC technology. And this is like a missile that it is GPS guided. So it doesn't go anywhere in the body. It's going straight to the target, which is the cancer cell. And what is on top of this missile? A warhead, which we call payload, a chemotherapy that is going to be targeting those cells. We know that some cancer cells express some proteins. Then we create an antibody, but it is attracted by these proteins. The antibody is the GPS system. Then we have a payload, which is the warhead. It can be chemical or nuclear or tactical, depends on what you want to attack. And then you need to link the two together, and that is called the conjugation. That means that we believe that in the next 10 years, most of the general chemotherapies could be replaced with targeted therapies like that. They have way less side effects because the chemotherapy attacks also the healthy cells. Right now, we can minimize the impact on the healthy cells and maximize the impact on the cancerous cells.
How far along are we in the process with this new technology of really having something that will start curing people?
I think already we start having dramatic results that, for example, they can triple the life expectancy of the current standards of care. But I don't think it will be a miracle that will come from one day to another. It will be, though, constant improvement every quarter. We will have, not only us, but others as well, releases of new data, of new medicines. Eventually, some of these cancers will be cured, which means that they will disappear and will not come back again. But many of them will become chronic disease. You can learn to live with your cancer with medicines that are not affecting the quality of your life.
Pfizer is not alone in looking for ways to make cancer more manageable. Research has a key ally in artificial intelligence.
I think it allows several things. First is it makes diagnosis and treatment planning more accurate. You know, we're moving away from one size fits all in terms of treatment of cancer or many other conditions. We know that each of us has different manifestations of the way a tumor is going to grow or spread, and also how it's going to respond to treatment. And we need to be able to bring the best treatment to each patient at that particular moment in time, and AI is enabling us to do that.
Dr. Lloyd Minor is the dean of the Stanford University's School of Medicine, where he has pushed the institution to focus on precision health, intended to tailor care to patients' individual needs.
I think really we're finding things otherwise we would have not found, because the human brain can only store so much information, and traditional analytic methods have their limitations. Generative AI is bringing out relationships that we would have perhaps never been able to garner without the advent of foundation models and their application to the interpretation of medical data. I think the deployment of generative AI, the pace of that deployment and its impact is greater and faster than the pace of any technological innovation that I've seen in my life. And I think we're still at the relatively early stages.
DeepMind's AlphaFold is proof of how much AI can do in the medical field. It uses its vast computational power trained by 170,000 proteins to predict protein structures.
I remember when I was starting in college, I joined this lab and we were crystallizing proteins and putting the coordinates of their atoms into a database along with many others. And I remember Professor Steve Harrison, who was the leader of our lab, telling us, it might take 50 years before we're able to predict how a protein folds given its amino acid sequence.
Marty Chavez has been a fixture on Wall Street since 1993 when he joined Goldman Sachs. But his biochemistry roots go back to his undergraduate days at Harvard University. Today, he serves as a board member of Alphabet, whose subsidiary, DeepMind, won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for AlphaFold last year.
They gave it the 50,000 amino acid sequences or proteins that had been sequenced, and the structure was known through crystallography. They trained the neural network on that database, the protein data bank, and then they did something kind of amazing, which is they then guessed 75,000 protein sequences for which the structure was not known. So here's the amino acid sequence, guess the structure. They fed those guesses back into the model, and then, I'm oversimplifying, of course, but now the model seems to predict with uncanny accuracy the shape in space of proteins that have never been crystallized. It seems that the model discovered some deep patterns in the way proteins fold in space and somehow compressed and captured that knowledge into the model.
We hear a lot about generative AI, and there were just a Nobel Prize given out for the AlphaFold technology. What does that mean, if anything, for cancer? How does those two fit together?
Well, it's, I believe, not only for cancer, but also for cancer. It's going to propel the biological research, AI, in unprecedented ways. We are going to shorten the time that we need to be able to develop molecules.
What's the time horizon, as far as you understand it, for generative AI really making a big difference?
I think quick. I think already we are deploying it, so it made very big difference in the example that I gave you. But as we are deploying in different aspects of the process from discovery to development, I think within the next 2-3 years we will have phenomenal results.
Bourla points out that Pfizer is investing twice what it made off of COVID treatments to address the scourge of cancer, and it will need to replicate some version of that COVID success in redirecting its efforts. After its stock price surged from that success, shares are down nearly 50% since December 2021, leading activist investor Starboard to take a $1 billion stake in Pfizer, turning up pressure on the company to prove the value of its Seagen acquisition and investment in its drug line. I know that you're committed to this fight against cancer, as is Pfizer, to save lives, first and foremost. But it's also a business. How big a business opportunity is it potentially if you really have breakthroughs?
It is a very big business opportunity. I'll tell you something. There is a myth about the pharmaceutical business model. And the myth says that whatever is good for patients and whatever is good for shareholders is fundamentally at odds. In fact, the reverse is true. You can't make any money. Actually, you're going to lose all your money in this business unless you are able to discover very meaningful, not me-too solutions, very meaningful solutions for the patients. So if we discover medicines that really double and triple the survival, then it's very good business. If we fail, because we take a lot of risk, it's not good business.
You always have new drugs in the pipeline. Where are you on cancer drugs in the pipeline right now at Pfizer?
It is the crown jewel. We are having most of our pipeline drugs, and the most important are coming from cancer. Of course, we have vaccines, we have internal medicines, we have work in obesity, we have work in arthritis and immunoinflammation, but cancer is where we have most of them. And I would say that 3 of the most prominent candidates are entering or have entered or are about to enter phase 3 studies.
For Dr. Bourla, the mission to make life more livable with cancer is worthwhile because it is a disease that affects us all, no matter where we come from or who we are.
It is a global problem and affects all of us. Maybe not all of us as patients, thankfully, but all of us as sons and daughters, as fathers and mothers, unfortunately, as friends, as neighbors. So cancer is something that is scaring people right now. And it is not only in the US or in Europe or in the most advanced economically countries.
Coming up, President Trump says he wants to get federal spending down. Bridgewater founder Ray Dalio gives us his diagnosis for what could turn into a debt crisis and what the president and Congress need to do to avoid it. This is a story about going broke. Whether you're a person, a company, or an entire nation, it all comes down to the same thing: not being able to pay your debts as they come due.
The U.S. federal government's fiscal policy is on an unsustainable path. The level of our debt relative to the economy is not unsustainable. The path is unsustainable.
The United States has been running up a large tab for years now, going from a debt of $5.7 trillion in 2000 to over $35 trillion in 2024. And so far, it doesn't show any signs of slowing down, with the Congressional Budget Office projecting that, at the rate it's going, the U.S. will owe over $50 trillion by 2035, or about 118% of its annual GDP.
The debt ceiling was...
The Trump administration comes to office aware of the challenge posed by the federal debt and is taking steps it says will help address the problem.
The federal government has a significant spending problem.
Bridgewater founder Ray Dalio has written a new book,
available at no charge online, addressing the U.S. debt problem. It's called How Countries Go Broke. And he starts with how much the U.S. is going to have to borrow and who will lend it the money it needs.
The difference is they can print money. And then that's basically it. So what you have is a situation where there's a supply and a demand for debt. As we have a new supply, that will equal in the United States now, by the way, this is a problem elsewhere too, but it's about 7.5% of GDP. So the supply of debt is going to be large. That's new debt. If I calculate also who are the buyers of that debt, and that there's not going to be enough demand for that debt. It doesn't look like there'll be enough demand. And the way that it works, so there's two things to keep in mind. There's supply and demand, and then what do central banks do, or what do the governments do when they don't have enough demand? Central banks come in and make up that demand. They essentially print money, and then they buy that. And then that has a consequence. And so just like in 2020, 21, we went through, they needed to give money away, and the government needed to borrow, and the central bank produced the money and bought that. That devalues money, raises inflation, and so on.
Thus far, the United States has been able to support ever-growing debt and deficits because of that ability to print money. But Dalio warns that throughout history, countries have run up against the demand of creditors sooner or later to get paid.
It is when the owners of that debt, we have, over $36 trillion essentially of government debt, when they start to also fear that it may be monetized, like the Japanese. Japanese is a very good example. Japanese, if you have terrible investment to own bonds, they didn't go down in value, but you got an interest rate that was 3% below another interest rate, U.S. interest rate by way of example, and the currency depreciated by 3.5%. They were losing 6.5% a year for many, many years. That's what it can be like. Of course, there's an inflation component that enters into the depreciation. One of the things I also want to emphasize is people pay too much attention to depreciation against another exchange rate. Normally at such times, many countries have this issue, and they don't want their currency to depreciate. So what you see is the depreciation of all currencies in relationship to things like gold or other assets, and that's where you have to pay attention to it.
So if there is a debt wall out there somewhere that we will run into, how close are we to it? And how can we tell? As with our personal finances, Dalio says it's when we end up borrowing not to invest in our future, but to pay the interest on what we've already borrowed.
Debt isn't a problem if the debt is used to produce an income that is large enough or larger than enough to service the debt. It's like a company, if you were like your finances. But what happens is it accumulates, tends to accumulate. Think of it like a disease that has a progression, and it goes through these various stages. And so you can kind of see where the stages are. We're relatively late in the cycle because we're also having central banks lose money. That's a marker. When their balance sheet deteriorates, when they have a negative net worth. For example, in the UK, can the central bank have a negative net worth? According to their laws, the central government has got to recapitalize the bank. That becomes a budget item. So there are certain red flags. There are a bunch in this study that I've put out so that you could see them. Debt service payments, borrowing to borrow. So we are in the later stages of this. This is something that will be, I think, the most important issue that we'll be talking about. We're not talking about it now, but we will be talking about it over the next few months because the budget is the issue.
Dalio sees signs in the market that now point toward the end of the cycle.
What happens is that you see interest rates rise, led by the long end, when there's an easing of monetary policy and the currency depreciating. Well, you think, wait, isn't the Fed lowering interest rates? Isn't the Bank of England lowering interest rates? Why are long-term interest rates going up? Okay, they're not intervening. Well, there must be something with the supply demand of those bonds, because it's not their transactions that are driving those interest rates up. And the currency is falling at the same time. Okay, that is reflecting leaving, in other words, selling the bonds and leaving that instrument. So when you have that dynamic, it's a red flag. So we're having elements of that dynamic. So not only is the supply-demand operating that way, but the market action is operating that way.
If Dalio is right, if the United States is approaching the end of what he calls the long debt cycle, what should it do to make sure it doesn't hit that wall?
There are three factors that drive the budget deficit. Spending, cut spending, it'll be reduced. Taxes, raise taxes, not tax rates, but taxes. Sometimes you can cut tax rates and get that more tax revenue. So I just want to say taxes, tax revenue. But interest, if the government was operating as a unit with the central bank and there was a coordination, if there was a fiscal tightening coordinated with monetary easing, both of those things reduce the problem. And so an action of getting it at 3% of GDP, if I scream out a number, the 3% solution, I think that the policymakers have to start from the top and say 3% of GDP. We can do this. We will do this in one way or another. They can't let their pet programs, I think they don't have that mantra. They don't have what is the amount, and then they have to agree, at least if we can't agree, what do we do? Do it proportionately. Whatever you do, you must do this, because if you don't, you are risking what I would call, this heart attack due to that constriction of debt service payments and or a piece of that plaque breaking off, sort of the sale of those bonds. You're risking that needlessly. And so many things are so beautiful, you don't need to do that.
In the end, Dalio's How Countries Go Broke isn't simply a jeremiad. It does warn of some pretty dire consequences if we don't act, and don't act soon. But he also sees a path forward toward what he calls a beautiful deleveraging.
A beautiful deleveraging, one way or another, is there's ways of reducing your debt and debt burdens, some of which are deflationary and some of which are inflationary. And if you balance those, you will reduce it in a balanced way. That's what I mean by beautiful deleveraging. So, for example, fiscal spending cuts or tightening, raising taxes, will reduce the debt burden, but it's a deflationary influence. There's interest rates, and reducing interest rates is a stimulative way because it reduces debt service payments directly for the government, so they have a lower debt bill, and it also is stimulative to the economy at the same time, which can raise tax revenues and also raise asset prices. If we think beyond what our usual constraints are about dealing with the budget, in other words, don't just think about spending and taxes as vehicles, but also think about interest rates and the interest rate component. That could be a balance dealing with that reduction that can accomplish the goal without being depressing and gets it on a better fiscal track.
Coming up, Ray Dalio on what his analysis of debt and the economy means for other countries. Pretty much everyone agrees that the United States is...
What is the economic impact of land degradation? Land provides us with 50% of the wealth that we have today. Without healthy land, we cannot have healthy business. The question is, how can we find the balance? It is not only feasible, but it is economically viable.
$1 invested in land can give us a return of $7 to $30. We need to really change our business models to secure a sustainable future.
Facing a challenge in making sure that its increasing debt doesn't affect its economy. But what about the rest of the world? Are other countries facing some of the same structural issues the U.S. is facing? Bridgewater founder Ray Dalio took us around the world of debt cycles.
China is going through its debt cycle, and they've been slow to react to it. But it's in the sectors that are not the central government sector. It's in the local government sector and assets. There are things that they need to do, and it depends how quickly they need to do them. Here are the things that they need to do, or countries need to do when they're at this stage. You need to have interest rates below the inflation rate and below the nominal economic growth rate, okay? Because there's so much holding of cash. And when you have deflation and you have asset prices going down, and it pays to hold cash, particularly in an uncertain environment, and so you have these large cash holdings, we called that pushing on a string in the Great Depression. You need to make it unattractive to hold that. That lets the currency weakens. These are the things that need to be done. China has been slow to do that. So that's for the economy as a whole. I should say there are also parts in the economy that are not affected by the debt much, okay? Some of the, like the AI parts of the economy and applications and so on are not. So it's a complicated situation, but China risks the Japan situation if they don't deal with it they, in my opinion, have been too slow. And if they don't achieve these things, the beautiful deleveraging, the negative real rates, the depreciation, if they don't move on that, I think it'll go on a while. If you're taking surplus countries, because you're talking about surplus countries, when I look at it, I look at these same four forces. How are they doing financially? What's the income statement and balance sheet? Are they earning more than they're spending? And do they have more assets than they have liabilities for a country? I look at countries that do they have internal order? Do they have an environment where there's working together and there's internal order to be creative with talented people being unleashed to do productivity? Number two. Number three, are they at risk of a war, an international war that will disrupt them? Number four is, okay, will they be major impacted by the climate issue and so on? And then number five, what is this technology going to do for them? So the places that you're referring to, when I look through those lenses, and you can see which the better places are and which they aren't. And I did it's online, many different measures of the health of a country, top 24 countries. It's online. You can see the indicators. And with those indicators, you can see which are the better places. We have, on the war, don't get in a war. There's the winners and there's the losers of the war, and there's the neutral countries. And then if we're looking also at some of the terrific countries, the ASEAN countries, India, these are places where, for various reasons, things are changing. Indonesia, these are places where things are changing. I could just go on at length at it, but I'll take up too much time.
Technology, as you say, we have to talk about technology. Generative AI seems to be transforming much of our world over the next few years. Could that change your entire debt cycle? Could that really change it and make sure we don't have a debt crisis the way we might otherwise?
Yeah, it certainly could. I think it's the greatest in all history technological change. There's the printing press, and then there's the Industrial Revolution. This applies to all thought. But I take it from my perspective. When I started Bridgewater and all along the way, we put in computer code rules, criteria, principles, I call them, for decision making. So we would do it through expert systems code. And they would make decisions because they could see things more complicated. We are coming to way beyond that. So this is going to have a huge effect, but it's going to have an effect over the next 3 years. The miracles capability are continuing to exist. But when will you make it that your decisions are made in parallel, like making a computer chess game? The way we build systems is you make like a computer chess game, and then it makes decisions while we're making decisions. So the ability to have productivity increases in so many different ways are so enormous that they could definitely change things a lot. They're farther out there. To me, this year looks like the indicators and so on look a little bit more like 98 or 99, you know. That asset prices, particularly of the big scalers, the prices are getting higher. There's a risk, an interest rate risk, that is going to be entering the market that we just talked about. And those risks are very important. So I think with evolution, it can be terrific, but also how you deal with it. What it's going to mean for employment, wealth gaps. Think about the differences in the wealth gaps. I mean, basically, about 3 million people are those who are the unicorns, and that's a wonderful world. Go to the best universities, come out and be inventive and entrepreneurship and so on. About 3 million people are in that world out of 333 million in the United States. And as I said, 60% of the population has a reading level below 6th grade. So how that's dealt with is going to be an issue.
From your study of history, you talk about 5 forces that really drive things. First being sort of the money cycle, credit. Second, domestic politics. Third, sort of international. Talk about the international for a second and tariffs specifically.
Okay.
How could that read against this? Are you relieved that at the moment, at least, it looks like President Trump is not moving too fast on across-the-board tariffs, for example, with China?
I'm a global macro investor, right? So global and macro. There are 5 forces that everything falls under. So we talked about the credit creates spending, creates markets, drives them. That's force number 1. Internal conflict, left, right, conflict over wealth and power and values. And that becomes greater extremism. And so you get greater polarity and populism of the left and the right and that. And does that create order or disorder? And then there's ideologies with all of that. Is it going to be taxes and so on? So we know that. Number 3 is the great geopolitical. We had a world order after 1945. Then that was when the world order began. The United States was the dominant power, and we had multilateralism and multinational organizations like the reason the United Nations is in New York, or the World Bank and IMF in Washington, D.C., and there's a World Trade Organization, and all these world organizations was the idea of how do we work together in a system and so on. We have shifted. So multilateralism is out, and we are openly said an America First policy, and so there are no rules. We're now in an environment that power determines things. So when we dealing with those issues, so that's number 3, the great power conflict. Number 3, number 4 is even more important than the first 3 is acts of nature. Droughts, floods, and pandemics have killed more people than wars and have created more toppling of empires and orders. And then number 5 is technology.
That does it for us here at Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. This is Bloomberg. See you next week for more stories of capitalism.
The proximate effect, of course, is that you protect some jobs in the industry that's tariffed. But there are effects that go in the other direction. When you put a tariff on steel, it gets more expensive for auto producers, and that makes them less competitive. When you put tariffs on, the dollar goes up, and that makes it more expensive for anybody who's trying to export products from the United States. When people pay higher prices because of tariffs, they have less money to spend on goods other than the tariff jobs, and that hurts jobs. So it's very hard to know which way the effect will go or whether there'll be any positive effect. It depends in part on what the Fed does, but the idea that protection is some kind of solvent that creates large